I've always dreamed of having my own nature preserve. A place where I could spend every day exploring forests, meadows, creeks, and ponds in search of my favorite animals. 2 years ago, that dream became a reality when I moved onto this acreage in the beautiful forests of Quebec, with the goal of managing the land to support as much wildlife as possible. Every day has brought its share of surprises, challenges, and unforgettable moments, from heartwarming stories to heartbreaking realities, and even wild encounters right outside our window. This is year 2 on the Wildlife Homestead. Before getting into year 2, I want to start with a quick recap of the first year on the Wildlife Homestead. We moved to this 30-acre property in early winter. The layout of the land is pretty simple. Up front we have our house with some open space that's mostly lawn. There's a trout pond that was stocked with brook trout over the years, which leads into a couple of acres of red pines that were planted to eventually be harvested. We then have a big chunk of the property that's mixed forest, mostly maples, birches, spruces, firs, and some beeches. Within this forest is another pond. This one doesn't have any fish, so it gets a lot of use from amphibians. And if you continue past the mixed forest, you eventually reach the end of the property with a coniferous stand of mostly spruces and balsam firs. The goal for the first year was to spend as much time as possible to observe and document all the species that were living here already. I'll be honest, it was very tempting to start a bunch of projects because I knew there were some sections that could really use improving if I wanted to attract more wildlife. But I'm glad that I held off because I was like a kid in a candy store the entire year. I've been interested in nature my whole life. As a kid, I'd spend my summers catching insects, snakes, and salamanders in the field behind our house. The thrill of discovering new species on the homestead brought back that same excitement I felt as a kid. It also felt like every observation meant more. When I found a new bird, a new insect, a new plant or mushroom, it wasn't just another species, it was another species that I'd be sharing the land with for many years to come. And I was incredibly proud of the ones we saw in the first year. From the overwintering birds, spring and fall migration, and the breeding season, we saw 109 different bird species. We had a couple dozen species of mammal, and thanks to the trail cameras, we were able to have a good amount of sightings of secretive ones like fishers and flying squirrels. We had a family of red foxes living under our garage, and a handful of amphibians that bred in our ponds. What was exciting was that I knew there were many projects that I could do throughout the property to draw in even more wildlife. So even though I had a good first year, it was really only a starting point, and I was excited for the projects and progress I could make in the upcoming year. In early winter, we officially began year 2 on the Wildlife Homestead. Everything slows down in the winter. It's become one of my favorite times of the year. Even if you don't like the cold, you have to admit the peacefulness and quietness is unmatched. Although everything is frozen and buried under a layer of snow, there's a lot of projects that I could do in the winter. There's building more nest boxes, starting plant trays to cold stratify native seeds, and running feeding stations. But there's one thing that I had been itching to do for the past year: thin the pine stand. Since we moved here last year, I knew that I'd eventually want to do something to improve this 2-acre section of forest. Row after row of pines spaced tightly together, blocking most of the sun from reaching the forest floor, doesn't really scream thriving ecosystem. But I wanted to do my due diligence and take the first year to observe what was using this pine stand before I started making any changes. What I found in this first year was a very quiet forest. There weren't any birds nesting here and the understory vegetation was really lacking. The best growth was along the edges of the forest where some light was getting through, and even at that I think I would consider it pretty sparse. We did have a handful of red squirrels that would hang out in here and the odd bird foraging or passing through. But when I compared it with the rest of the property and how busy the other patches of forest were, I confirmed what I initially thought, that this planted pine stand would be a broken system. While red pine is native to our region and does offer benefits, a dense planting like this lacks the diversity and structure to support more wildlife. I mean, just looking up you can see how weak the crowns are and how little cover they're actually providing. Now, I will say that this is by design. This area was obviously planted with the intention to harvest the timber, and for that purpose, this is a great setup. But my goal with this patch and with the property in general is to have a healthy, productive forest to benefit as much wildlife as possible. To achieve this, we need diversity and complexity from the canopy to the understory. That means filling this area with native trees, shrubs, grasses, forbs, snags, down logs, brush piles, and wildlife boxes. So in December, I slowly began to thin the pines to breathe new life into this forest. This is what the area looked like when I started. You can really see how dense some sections are, but there is one spot where a few larger trees were removed some time ago. This allowed enough light in for these poplars and some smaller shrubs to grow in this opening, so the idea is to replicate this in the thicker areas to get more sunlight to the forest floor and stimulate new plant growth. My goal is to keep the biggest, healthiest red pines and remove the rest. Then in the growing season I'll come in and replant the area with productive native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers that we don't already have growing on the property. That way the wildlife will still get the benefits from the pines as they grow taller, thicker crowns, and produce more cones, all while our new plants are establishing and filling in the gaps below. Another element I want to include within this forest is a wildflower meadow. We do have a good variety of flowers dotted around the property, but we don't have a dedicated area for pollinators. I didn't see any monarch butterflies last year, so I'll include plenty of milkweeds to try to attract our first ones. The meadow was the first area I got started on, and I knew it would require full sunlight for the flowers to thrive, so I began by expanding on the existing clearings. I won't bore you with all of the cutting, it's pretty repetitive work, just notch, drop, and cut into sections. I'll use the branches to make brush piles, and I have a bunch of ideas for ways to use the wood for different wildlife projects that I'll share throughout this series. But I do want to leave a fair bit of it on the ground to start breaking down and feeding the soil. I also wanted to keep a few dead trees standing to create snags for woodpeckers, so I girdled a couple dozen trees using 2 different techniques. The first was just stripping the bark in a ring around the tree, and the other was the double girdle technique. This didn't work out as I had hoped because even a year later, every one of these trees are as green as the day I girdled them. It was my first time trying this and I think my cuts were just too shallow, so this winter I'll have to try again. I'll be honest, doing this work was pretty hard, not because of the physicality, but because of the birds. It was an incredible year for seed and cone production on the Wildlife Homestead. I thought our first year was a good year for wintering birds, but I had no idea how low those numbers were. Just as an example, if you watch the older videos, one of my targets was an evening grosbeak. When I finally got them last year, there were about a dozen and I was over the moon, but this year, day in and day out, we had over 300 of them filling the forest with their loud, burry calls. And they would be mixed in with hundreds of pine siskins, red poles, goldfinch, red, and white-winged crossbills. At the front of the property, we even had over 200 snow buntings, and they had a pretty sweet setup. They would just hang out on our roof, and whenever they felt like it, they would come down to feed on some cracked corn. A lot of these birds weren't feeding in the pine stand, unfortunately. Most of the pines are in a tight race to overtake the ones next to them, and putting energy into cone production instead of growing taller could mean the difference between life and death. So the majority of them didn't produce cones, but the ones along the edge of the stand and in the open did, which tells me once I give the other trees enough space and sunlight, they'll also be able to produce this valuable winter resource for wildlife. Hindsight is 2020, but if I had known when we moved here that this winter would be so productive, I may have been tempted to start thinning the pine stand in year 1. But I can't go back in time, so I tried my best to both thin the pines and take breaks to look for wildlife. I had a loop that I would do to check on things, and the first stop was always right beyond the pine stand, where I'd have a small group of Canada jays that would come to visit me. Chickadees, which we'll see a little later, are known to be curious birds, but in my experience, Canada jays take that curiosity to another level. Over hundreds of years, they've showed they're more than comfortable to live alongside people. Their fearlessness around humans and their willingness to exploit food sources left unattended have given them the nickname camp robbers, which I think is a testament to their intelligence and their resourcefulness to find food sources in cold northern climates. So it only took this trio a few days to figure out that I was the one filling the suet feeders, and from time to time they would visit me to collect the suet tax. While walking the trails, I'd also look around for any new tracks. We had a very mild winter with far less snow than last year. This is a shot of the forest pond at the peak of winter in 2023. You can see how high the snow is on the posts. And this is from our peak this year. Having less snow meant the wildlife didn't depend on our trails as much, so although we had even more tracks than last year, they were all over the place, which made it a little bit more difficult to get trail camera footage. But I'm still happy with the mix of species that we got. Look at this, there's some weasel tracks coming out of the snow. There's some mouse tracks on top of the snow, and they met here in the middle for lunch. Just beyond the forest pond, I would check on the barred owl boxes that I built this winter. It's very unlikely they use them this year, but in spring, when young barred owls fledge and search for territories of their own, I'm hoping they claim one of these boxes. I also had another frequent stop nearby to spend some time with a chickadee pair that I've gotten to know since moving here. I finally gave them nicknames Dot and Tui. Tui got its name by being the only chickadee to always try to grab 2 seeds at a time. Tui's also a little more carefree than Dot. Usually chickadees will grab a seed and fly to a nearby branch to crack it open, but Tui has no issues with sitting on my finger and using it as a stick instead. Dot, on the other hand, is shy. It'll quickly grab a seed and take off. I came up with the very original name Dot because of the small white dot it has behind its right eye. It's subtle, but most chickadees look almost identical, so I'm always searching for tiny differences to distinguish them, whether that's through visual or behavioral differences. My last stop on my breaks would be at the apple trees up front. I've mentioned several times that one of the elements our property is really lacking is winter fruit. So I wanted to do an experiment this winter to see how much wildlife we can bring in if we keep the apples in the trees instead of harvesting them. And I'm happy to report this was a raging success. From September to March, these trees have been magnets for birds and mammals. They even brought in a new species to the Wildlife Homestead, the stunning Bohemian waxwing. The apples also kept a pair of wild turkeys around for the winter. These two have been here since the summer, and they lived quite peacefully for many months, but with snow accumulating and resources diminishing, and with the breeding season around the corner, I could see the dynamics were starting to shift. It started with a few displays, but nothing too serious. Then a couple of days later, it turned into an all-out brawl. I've never seen turkeys fighting this close, and I doubt I'll ever get a better view than this. This is right outside of my living room window. At first, they tried striking each other with the sharp spurs on their legs. After a bit of back and forth, they eventually locked beaks, and this part of turkey fighting can be pretty brutal. In this case, one of the turkeys was completely inside the other's beak, and it looked like it had a hold of its tongue. The whole fight lasted about 3 minutes, 2 of which were with locked beaks. The loser took off into the bushes and was never seen again, and the dominant male now patrols our property alone. So this is what my winter looked like. As I continued to thin the pine stand, I slowly started to see the area take shape. All around me were signs of warmer spring days ahead, a caterpillar crossing the snow on a sunny day, open water starting to form from the snowmelt, and the first nest of the season. Because of the insulation provided by the tree, cavity nesters can usually get a pretty good head start on the nesting season. And that's exactly what this female red-breasted nuthatch is doing. Compared to woodpeckers, nuthatches aren't nearly as strong at excavating their cavities, so they tend to seek out softer dead trees, especially ones that are filled with fungi. This makes the whole excavation process quicker and easier. One behavior that I found interesting was how she would often carry the shavings away from the cavity to discard them. If she drops them right outside the hole every time, the collection of shavings would become almost like a neon sign to predators that there was a nest here. It's a really smart way to protect all of her hard work. Before the snow fully melted, there was enough open ground to start a new project, building a pond. At the front, we have a trout pond, and it's a decent size, but the only amphibians that breed here are green frogs. Most of our early spring breeders like wood frogs, blue-spotted, and spotted salamanders tend to avoid this pond because of the fish. So building a smaller, fish-free pond nearby would give them another potential breeding site and add a water feature that we're lacking on the Wildlife Homestead. The goal was to build a vernal pond, which is a shallow, seasonal pond that'll hold water just long enough for our target species to complete their life cycle in, usually 2 to 3 months. So early this spring, we started to dig this vernal pool below the existing trout pond. We wanted to build a completely natural pond with no liners, and this was the perfect place to do it. Snowmelt, rainwater, and some overflow from the trout pond flow directly through this grassy area, so we'll have plenty of water filling up the pond naturally. And most importantly, the soil here is deep clay, which is the key to having the pool hold water. We started by digging these small, shallow pools to funnel water down to the main pond. When snow starts to melt in the spring, water can really rush through this section, so having something to catch and slowly divert water down will be great for minimizing erosion and trapping excess nutrients. To dig the main pool, we used a backhoe to scoop up clay and pile it along the backside to form a small dam. This isn't the traditional way of doing it, but since we were aiming for a seasonal pool and not a permanent pond, it only had to be sealed enough to hold water for a few months. On the opposite side of the dam, we made a gentle slope so wildlife can get in and out of the pond more easily, and we dug the deepest section to around 2 feet deep, which might seem a little shallow, but most natural ephemeral ponds are only 3 feet deep or less, so it's what most vernal pool species are adapted to living in. Overall, this only took us a couple of hours. This is what it looked like when we finished up, and the next day, most of the sediment had settled down and it was already looking clearer. I then leveled out the dam and seeded it with native grasses and wildflowers. I added some branches for amphibians to attach their eggs to and for dragonflies to perch on, and a bucket of leaves to provide cover on the pond floor. This was finished right on time because not long after, the sound of frogs filled the air throughout the Wildlife Homestead, and I found 5 wood frog egg masses floating in the new vernal pond. Spring was officially here. With the snow now melting, there was something new to look forward to every day. Near the top of my list was to see the little creek that runs through our property open up again. This spot has quickly become my favorite to run trail cameras at. You may remember that last year I set up a log that goes across the creek, and I even set up a camera trap to get photos of the animals crossing. Unfortunately, my plans were foiled by raccoons as they quickly knocked over the sensor, rendering the whole setup useless. By the time I went to check on it, my tripod was frozen in the ground, so that had to sit there all winter. But I was excited to see what had showed up over the winter months. One thing that I'll probably do this winter is keep a shovel nearby so I can clear some of the snow and ice around the creek. It'll make the water more accessible, and I think it may help draw in even more animals. We'll check back on this camera in the fall to see all of the animals that have been crossing the creek. But before then, there is one more clip that I'd like to share. An adult barred owl came down here to hunt one morning. The exciting thing is, this is right around the time they should be feeding young, so that means they're nesting relatively close by. I know they're not on our land because I've stared at every single tree we have, and there aren't any cavities big enough to fit barred owls. They've also been triggering the camera by the forest pond, which is not far from where I set up those 2 owl boxes. It gives me hope that they've at least seen the boxes, and maybe one day we'll have them nesting on the property. Once the snow was fully melted, I went to continue working in the pine stand. I began building a trail system using some of the pine logs. These will rot over time and provide plenty of habitat for insects, salamanders, and fungi. I left little gaps between the logs for smaller wildlife to move in and out of, and it seemed to already pay off because I found the first garter snake of the season moving along these logs. I like to think that this trail will become a little highway for small animals trying to travel through the new forest. I also collected a lot of the branches to make large brush piles. Brush piles are probably the quickest and easiest habitat to build, especially for this area that didn't have a lot of cover to begin with. These piles will instantly give refuge to red squirrels and birds, and I've already noticed more sparrows using this forest. I know brush piles are a little unsightly, but one thing I've done in the past to improve them is to plant vines at the base of the piles. Over time, the vines will take over and it'll turn a dead brush pile into a living one, and if I plant something like grapes, it could also provide some fruit. But I'm thinking I'll start with flowering vines for the hummingbirds and pollinators. The next thing I got started on was the new wildflower meadow. I plan to both seed and plant plugs in the meadow using a few dozen species native to the Northeast, but before I can throw any seeds down, I have to deal with this thick layer of pine needles that I've collected here over the decades. Our seeds will have the best chance if they have good contact with the soil, so I started raking up all the branches and needles. Once the needles were cleared, I measured each section to figure out how much seed I needed. There's 3 different sections that are intersected by the trails. They each get varying degrees of sunlight, so it'll be interesting to see the species composition in each patch. The seeds that I'm using I've been collecting over the past few years, so they can be anywhere from 6 months old to 3 years old. Because of that, I'm not too sure how viable some of them are, but I won't find out unless I use them. The terrain is mostly flat, but there are little mounds that are drier and small depressions that hold more moisture, so by using many different species and casting a wide net, I'm increasing the odds that something will take. I checked the weather forecast before I seeded the meadow so I could time it with the rain. That way the seeds would get a good soaking, which will hopefully improve germination. And although everything was going to plan, nature would quickly throw not 1, but 2 wrenches into my plans. After the rain soaked in the seeds, we were hit with 3 weeks of abnormally warm and dry weather. So much so that I was debating coming in and watering the area by hand. And if that wasn't a bad enough start for the seeds, during that time we also had the biggest flock of juncos migrating through. I counted close to 1,000 of them just at the front of the property alone. They stuck around for a little less than a week, and of course they were in the new pine meadow feeding on the seeds I just spread. How many seeds they ate and which species they were targeting, I don't really know, but all I could do at this point was move on to other projects while I waited to see which species would germinate later in the season. One of the really nice things about looking back on all of the footage of the past year is that there's so many little moments that I almost forgot about. We had a pair of Canada geese hanging out at the trout pond for a few days during the migration. A leucistic evening grosbeak showed up at our feeders. This is it compared to the typical male and female plumage. There was a time I freaked out because I thought we had our first monarch butterfly show up, but it turned out to be the similar looking viceroy. One day I went out to take the garbage and found a spotted salamander underneath the bin. And the time I kept hearing a faint tapping behind me while I filmed the groundhog that lives under our large spruce tree, only to find out that tapping was a chickadee excavating a new cavity. Throughout the year, the big moments are easy to remember, like foxes living under our garage, the first birds nesting in a box I built, a new species on the trail camera. But it's these little moments that are so easy to forget that I think I'll really appreciate many years from now. Another thing that completely slipped my mind this spring was that I had set up nesting ledges under the eave of our garage the year before. I intended for these to be used by barn swallows. Sadly, we only had one fly over during the migration. But this year I woke up to find a robin starting to build a nest on one of the platforms. They wake up bright and early to get to work. It's the female that does the nest building. She creates a base of dead grasses and twigs and later reinforces the nest with mud. I've watched birds build cup nests before, but it's usually been from far away with binoculars. But being this close, it's the first time I can hear the sound of a bird forming the cup, and it's probably my new favorite thing. After 7 days of building, she adds the finishing touches to the nest. Fine, soft grasses to keep the eggs and eventually the chicks comfortable and insulated. This is what the nest looked like when I started filming, and this is it when she finished. While she was finishing up, this is when the male started to escort her to and from the nest. Although he doesn't help directly with the building, his role is to defend the nest. He hangs out in the pines next to the garage and chases off any blue jay that comes too close. I'm hoping this nest is well protected from the red squirrels, but if a blue jay were to come along, there's no way to stop them, so the male has a very important job to do over the upcoming weeks. On the 8th and last day of building, she did the final shaping of the bottom of the cup and later laid her first egg. And over the next few days, she laid 2 more. While this was going on, I kept noticing another bird triggering this camera. To my surprise, just a few feet away, eastern phoebes were checking out the other nest platforms I set up for barn swallows. Eastern phoebes also build their nests on ledges, but unlike the robins, phoebes will sometimes begin by building multiple dummy nests. Over a few days, they brought nesting material onto 7 different ledges. I had no clue which one they were actually going to use, so I just picked one at random and put a camera on it. At first, it looked like I made the right choice. The female was visiting it frequently and bringing in new material. She would even press the moss with her body like she was forming the future cup. But over time, she seemed to lose interest in this nest. She'd even take away material to bring it to another one, so I concluded that this was likely a dummy nest. There's a few reasons why birds build dummy nests. Sometimes they're used as a way to test if a site is safe and stable enough before committing to a final nesting location. They can also be built as a way to claim multiple sites to prevent other birds from using them. Also, if their main nest gets destroyed or raided by a predator, they have backups already partially or fully built, so they don't have to start completely from scratch. Another reason, and probably the one I've observed the most, especially in other birds, is predator confusion. By building many dummy nests, they can confuse and distract potential nest predators and make it more difficult for them to find the main one with the eggs or the chicks. I experienced this firsthand because while this dummy spent a few days staring at these ledges, trying to figure out which one the phoebes would use, they were secretly building another nest under our patio. Just to be safe, I also put a camera on another ledge that has a well-built nest, so I think we have all of our bases covered. I'm kinda hoping they go with the garage just because there's no way to predator-proof the patio nest, so it would be the most vulnerable to squirrels, but we'll have to see what they decide. Bird and other wildlife boxes tend to have more success the longer they're out. This is the second breeding season, and I've noticed higher occupancy in our boxes. One surprise was a hive of bumblebees that took over one of the bluebird houses. I've never looked inside a bumblebee nest before, so later in the fall, I'll come back to check what's in this nest box. In early May, tree swallows started to funnel in. Last year we had 1 pair show up, but this year I was excited to see a dozen swallows hanging around. It's hard to tell which ones will stay in nest and which ones are just migrating through, but a few pairs were inspecting our boxes every morning. Little did they know that chickadees were also interested in this box, but they would only visit in the afternoon. So for about a week straight, they were unknowingly fighting for the same box. Swallows were making themselves at home in the morning, and chickadees in the afternoon. Eventually, the chickadees found one of the boxes that I made specifically for them, and not long after, it was officially move-in day for the tree swallows. Once the grasses and leaves were brought in, the next step was to bring in as many feathers as possible. I've had a few cameras on tree swallow nests over the years, and I've always found it interesting how good they are at finding feathers. In our area, I wouldn't be surprised if they get some help from the resident sharp-shinned hawk pair. The feathers they leave behind from a kill would be perfect for swallows and any other bird to line their nest with. Even after the first eggs were laid, they were still bringing in new feathers, and unfortunately, all of them eventually covered our view of the eggs, so I couldn't tell how many she ended up laying. I wasn't too bothered though, because just a nest box away, I had a camera on another tree swallow pair. There was a pretty good view of their 6 eggs, but in no time they were also completely covered with feathers. So I got the hint, these tree swallows obviously wanted some privacy, so we'll have to check in on them a little later. While our tree swallow pairs and our robins were sitting on eggs, our female phoebe finally decided on a nesting site for the season. After completing the nest under our patio, this is where she decided to lay her first egg. Early on, the female doesn't spend much time at the nest. She won't start incubating until all of the eggs are laid. And she lays 1 a day until the nest is filled with 5 bright white eggs. For the next 2 weeks, it's her responsibility to tend to these eggs while the male keeps a watchful eye and comes in with the occasional food delivery. Nearby, the robin eggs had just finished hatching. With both parents working all day to collect food, feedings are happening every few minutes, and it doesn't take long for these chicks that are barely visible in this cup to completely fill up this space. I like to think that this overcrowding is by design. These birds can only take so many wing beats to the head from their siblings before they're just itching to fledge the nest. After spending a few days stretching out their wings, the whole clutch fledged. Unfortunately, the camera missed every single one of these birds leaving, but at least they hadn't gone too far. They stayed nearby in the pine stand to continue to grow and to learn from their parents. It was around this time that I started replanting the whole front section of the property. When deciding which plants I wanted to put in, I went with species that are native to our region that we either don't already have or that we have very few of. Having the plants that evolved alongside the local wildlife will give me the best bang for my buck, so to speak, in pretty much every aspect. They'll produce higher quality pollen, nectar, fruits and nuts that will provide the wildlife with the proper nutrients they need when they need them. A greater number of insects will be able to carry out their life cycles on the leaves, stems, and bark. And of course, more insects means more food for animals higher up in the food chain. So here's a rough outline of what my vision is for this space. At the front, I want to add more trees and shrubs to create a thick forested hedgerow. Then surrounding the vernal pond and the trout pond will be a couple of wet meadows, along with slightly drier wildflower meadows up front, as well as the new one that I seeded in the pine stand. The rest of the pine stand will just be thinned and replanted with trees and shrubs. There's also this one patch of pines beside our garage that I had trouble deciding what I wanted to do with, so I didn't touch it this year, but I do have a really fun project planned for this space that I'll be sharing early next spring. With a plan in place, it was now time to replant this whole area with productive native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers. I kinda blacked out from excitement when I did my order, so I got in a lot more than I thought. Between the ones that I ordered, the ones that I grew myself from seed, and the ones that I collected from other parts of the property to transplant here, I put in somewhere around 2,000 plants. I started by working on the meadow up front. Last year I let this area just grow out to see what was already established, and the results weren't terrible, but I think I can definitely improve it. Currently it's about 60 to 70% non-native or invasive grasses and forbs, so this year I went in and added native wildflower plugs throughout this whole meadow. Even though I planted a few hundred plants in here, I feel like it's barely noticeable. It'll take time for them to grow and fill out this space, but I'm going to continue to grow flowers and grasses to plug in here every spring. That way over time we can shift this patch from non-natives to more productive native plants. I'm pretty much doing the same thing beside this meadow at the vernal pond and the trout pond. The water is a good attractant for wildlife, but equally as important is the vegetation that surrounds the ponds. Not only does it improve the water quality by preventing erosion and trapping excess nutrients from entering the water, but it's also where a lot of the wildlife that are attracted to the ponds concentrate. But once I was done planting around the ponds, the next step was replanting trees and shrubs along the front of the property and in the pine stand. I still have more pines to cut and some cleanup I needed to do, but unfortunately I couldn't get to any of it because I started finding nests scattered around this whole area. Here's a map of all the ones that I found. The ones in red are confirmed nests, and the ones in yellow are sites where I saw nesting behavior, but I didn't really have the time to find the actual nest. I could have maybe worked around them, but I think I'd be way too stressed, and I'm sure the birds wouldn't appreciate all the noise, so instead of doing everything in one year like I wanted, I'll have to spread this work out over the next year. But luckily for now, I cut enough in the first round that there's a lot more light getting through here than there was before. In this pine stand, I divided it into two rough sections for replanting. There's an easy section and a hard one. The easy side is where the forest transitions from pine stand to more of a mixed forest. In this area, plants were able to creep their way in and fill in the understory, so I didn't really have to do as much planting in here, besides adding a few canopy trees like oaks. The hard side is where there was either nothing growing or mostly invasive plants, and this is where I focused most of my efforts to fill in these gaps. It'll take a while for these trees and shrubs to fill in the space, so I also cleared more of the needles and seeded the area with wildflowers to grow here as the trees mature. I wanted to come in with my own native seeds because if I don't, this area will fill up with invasive hawkweed. This stuff grows absolutely everywhere and it outcompetes our native vegetation. And this means that it is present in the new pine meadow that I created earlier this spring. By letting in more light and clearing the pine needles to expose the soil, I've started an all-out war. The native seeds I spread here are growing well, but most are perennials that will only start to flower and take off in years 2, 3, and beyond, so progress is slow. Trees and shrubs have also been trying to take over this area, as well as some invasive flowers, so it's pretty chaotic in here. To make sure the trees and shrubs don't dominate the meadow, I'll have to come in once a year and cut back the vegetation. And in terms of invasive wildflowers, I'll never be able to remove 100% of them, but I'm using a couple of different techniques to minimize their impact. The first is manually removing them. It took me a day to take out all the hawkweeds in the pine meadow, and in their place I planted native wildflower plugs. If I do this often enough, our native plants should establish and fill in this area, making it harder for the invasive species to take over in the future. The second thing I'm doing is fighting fire with fire. I'm putting in a few aggressive native species like common milkweed and some of our goldenrods that should be able to put up a much better fight against the invasives. At the end of the day, I'd rather have a meadow of aggressive native species than one filled with invasives. It's important to support as many insects as I can in these areas because they'll be the prime hunting ground for some of our nesting birds. And we were now entering a time when nests were full, young birds were hungry, and the demand for insects was at its highest. We've made it to summer. In early summer, I started seeing the same doe show up that had twins here last year. To my surprise, I saw her moving through our forest with not one or two, but 3 healthy little fawns. For white-tailed deer, having 1 fawn means it's usually a down year, 2 fawns is actually the norm, but 3 is excellent. And that usually happens when you have a mix of high-quality habitat and a healthy, mature doe. Last year we even had a moose with 2 calves, which is also above average, so it's nice to see that this area is providing them with plenty of resources and allowing them to thrive. Things were looking good on the Wildlife Homestead. A full family of deer, more insects filling our meadows, and the bird nests at the front were filled with eggs. And soon enough, chicks. Under the patio, there's pure excitement from the female Phoebe as her first chick was breaking through the egg. One by one, the eggs continued to hatch over the next 48 hours until there was 5 little Phoebe heads poking out of the nest. The female had sat on the eggs for about 2 weeks, and now it's also her responsibility to brood the chicks for the first couple of days. While she was tending the nest, the male was out gathering food to feed everyone. Like other members in the flycatcher family, Phoebes are incredible hunters. They'll perch anywhere and everywhere to give themselves a better vantage point, and while constantly scanning their surroundings, these strong and agile flyers are able to quickly jump into action. For an insect, I would imagine the only thing scarier than an eastern phoebe is an eastern phoebe with 5 hungry nestlings and a partner to feed. With parents this efficient at hunting, the chicks grew quickly over the next week. Around this time, we had a heat wave move through the area. 5 chicks huddled up in a moss-lined nest definitely made the heat wave a little bit harder on the phoebes. I'm not sure if it's because of the heat or because the chicks were just getting bigger, but this was the first night that the female wouldn't sleep on the nest. And sadly, little did she know, but this would be the last time that she'd see her chicks alive. That night, a mouse found its way to the nest and killed every phoebe. This is the unfortunate part of the breeding season. The parents can do everything right for weeks, but in just a few minutes, all of that time and energy could be for nothing. My biggest concern when the phoebes started building here was that there was no way to predator-proof this site. The garage was much higher and a lot safer, and after their first nest was raided, this was where the pair returned to. Luckily, one of their dummy nests from earlier in the season was almost fully built. After some finishing touches, it didn't take long for the female to lay 4 eggs. A smaller clutch than her first, but this late in the season, she probably wanted to incubate as quickly as possible. I knew the phoebes would need all the help they can get, so I collected some tall branches and set them up around the meadows and ponds to give them even more places to hunt from. Eastern bluebirds also like to hunt insects from perches, so they were more than happy to start using these new branches. Like the phoebes, the bluebirds are also having to start a new clutch. They were originally nesting somewhere across the street, but given the time of the year, they wouldn't have had enough time for their first clutch to fledge, so the nest was likely raided. I was hoping to get a nest camera on this bluebird pair, but all of my cameras were already in occupied boxes. Just a few birdhouses away, the feathers in one of the tree swallow boxes finally moved, and I was able to see 6 pink nestlings wriggling around in the nest. From this point on, they won't be left unattended. The parents take turns hunting and watching over the chicks. At the second tree swallow nest, I was only able to get a good view of the chicks at around 1 week old. It's nice to see that this pair also had 6 eggs hatch, a very healthy clutch size for tree swallows. When both swallow nests were close to fledging time, the bluebirds were starting to feed young, and the phoebes were welcoming their new hatchlings into the world. Between all of the birds hunting for food for their young, as well as all the fledglings from other nests, this was probably the busiest time around the Wildlife Homestead, especially when it came to the new vernal pond. As the warm summer weather moved in, this is when the pond would go through its biggest transformation. The water levels began to fluctuate, and this is a key step in the life of the vernal pond. As the water evaporates, it exposes the soil and allows new seeds to germinate. Seemingly overnight, the water was surrounded by greenery. Our wood frog tadpoles now had even more hiding places in the pond. The vegetation that started growing was a mix between plants that I seeded and plants that were already established or in the seed bank, just waiting for the right conditions to come around. With this flush of plant life, this brought in more species to the pond. A great blue heron showed up to hunt, as well as a solitary sandpiper. But probably my favorite sighting was this juvenile American bittern. Bitterns usually hang out in large wetlands, well hidden amongst the tall grasses. This one only stayed for a few minutes before being flushed by a passing car, but the fact that the vernal pond was able to draw in this secretive species in the first place was incredibly rewarding. Despite the bird activity, hands down the most active and most noticeable animals were the dragonflies and damselflies. They moved back and forth between both ponds using the perches that I set up for them, which were perfect for surveying the water for an easy meal. Between the insects hovering above the water and the ones moving around the vegetation, they have endless options to choose from. Watching them fly is not only entertaining, it's almost hypnotizing. Dragonflies and damselflies are among the most ancient groups of insects, and surprisingly, their anatomy has gone largely unchanged for millions of years. But being the aerial acrobats that they are, they require large amounts of food to fuel this demand. Depending on their size, they can eat dozens or sometimes hundreds of small insects in a day, or they can go for quality over quantity and even hunt one of their own. With the breeding season in full swing, this energy demand is even higher. Males are constantly patrolling and defending their territory, waiting for any female to wander into their space. In the case of these bluet damselflies, this male has successfully initiated courtship with the female. He uses his specialized claspers at the end of his abdomen to grasp her neck. With a bit of maneuvering, she brings her abdomen up to the male to form a heart-shaped mating wheel. While in this position, the male will remove any sperm from previous matings, ensuring his own sperm has the best chance at fertilizing the eggs. This mating ritual isn't exclusive to bluet damselflies. Around the pond, many different species are locked in this mating wheel. Once fertilized, the female will begin laying the eggs. Every time her abdomen touches the water, she's depositing an egg. But this isn't the only way of laying. Sometimes she'll use her sharp ovipositor to slice into stems and inject her eggs directly into the plant tissue. This is one of the reasons why the vegetation around the pond is so important. Slowly but surely, things started to quiet down as more birds fledged the nest I was monitoring. With the adults circling with mouthfuls of insects, they were able to entice each chick to leave the nest. With no more swallows around, I shifted my focus on the bluebirds. Although I couldn't see inside the nest, it was interesting to watch what the adults were catching to feed the young. Before the young fledged, the parents really started to focus on catching larger grasshoppers, which were abundant around the ponds and meadows. In the span of a few days, bluebirds, chipping sparrows, song sparrows, and juncos all had their young fledged to nest. The only nest that was left was the eastern phoebes. Tucked high up under the eave of our garage, the parents fed the young without any issues for a couple of weeks. Late one afternoon, I saw a small bird sitting in the pines behind the garage. At a quick glance, I wasn't sure if this was one of the phoebes or if it was another young flycatcher, but funny enough, even at this age, the bird started doing the patented phoebe tail bob. It wasn't a picture-perfect nesting season for this pair, but they persevered through all of the ups and downs to successfully raise 4 chicks. By the end of July, all of the nests were empty and a lot of the young birds had left. It almost felt like a ghost town at the front of the property. But there was one spot that was drawing a lot of interest. In the planted pine stand that I thinned earlier this year, I left many logs along the path to decay with the hopes to attract smaller wildlife. Well, during the spring and most of the summer, wood-boring insects like this white-spotted Sawyer beetle were building up throughout the pine stand. They lay their eggs directly into the deadwood, and once hatched, the larvae begin to bore small channels into the logs. The sound of these insects got louder and louder throughout the summer as the larvae grew. To be honest, I was a little worried because for a while I didn't really find many predators along these logs to keep the beetle population in check. But it wasn't until late summer when I had consistent sightings of what I assume is the beetle's worst nightmare, ichneumoniid wasps. When people think of wasps, it's usually the social ones that build these paper nests and can wreak havoc in your yard. But social wasps make up less than 2% of all species. Most are solitary and are incredible hunters that help manage other insect populations. In the case of the ichneumoniid wasps I was finding in the pine stand, they use their long ovipositors to reach into the channels created by wood-boring insects and inject their eggs directly into the beetle larva. The wasp larva then consumes the beetle larva, undergoes metamorphosis, and later emerges as an adult wasp. A little later in the season, after the beetle's worst nightmare had mostly left, the Grim Reaper showed up, the hairy woodpecker. If my weak human ears can hear insects chewing in the wood, it's no surprise the woodpeckers were able to find them. They use their acute hearing to detect subtle sounds made by insects moving beneath the bark, which helps them identify promising spots for feeding without unnecessary drilling. Despite the fact that it's a bird ramming its head into a tree, I've always found it somewhat relaxing and satisfying to watch woodpeckers do their thing. The long tongue they use to extract grubs from the wood extends behind and around their skull to prevent any injuries while drilling. So fortunately for me, and unfortunately for the insects, these woodpeckers spent their entire days working on all the logs for a solid month. If the ichneumoniid wasp were the beetle's worst nightmare, and the hairy woodpecker was the Grim Reaper, I'm not so sure what you would call the pileated woodpeckers that showed up afterwards. About 10 times heavier than our smallest woodpecker, the downy, the pileated can peel large chunks of bark off with one strike. On the homestead, the pileatids are usually pretty shy, but the thing about them and most other woodpecker species is they sometimes become so fixated on what they're doing that they don't seem to pay attention to anything else. I was sitting in the grass and this pileatid came right up to me while I was foraging on the row of pine logs. The beauty about this log setup is that insects enter the logs, predators find some, but not all of them, so a percentage of beetles will reach adulthood. Then next year, the holes made by wood-boring insects and woodpeckers can potentially turn into cavities for other beneficial insects, where the whole cycle starts over again. These logs are conveniently placed right beside the new pine meadow, where I'm hoping a lot of these beneficial insects will get their pollen from. A first-year wildflower meadow that was spread from seed usually leaves a lot to be desired, and this new pine meadow was no different. I mentioned earlier that there's 3 different sections. Meadows 1 and 2 were doing decently well considering the juncos had a feast in here. It is a little patchy, but most meadows only have full coverage in the 2nd or 3rd years. Considering this was mostly bare under the shade of the pines last year, I'm happy with the results so far. I dotted these meadows with 100 or so plugs, and they've taken well and are already providing pollen and nectar to the insects. The 3rd meadow in the group is the one that's given me the most headaches. The seeds and plugs are growing, but there's a ton of poplars trying to establish in here. And even though I removed a lot of hawkweed earlier in the year, they're fighting back pretty hard. In the future, I'll probably have to spend a few hours every month just picking them out, at least until our native wildflowers establish. On the bright side, while doing this, I was able to see small perennial seedlings growing below the hawkweeds. After I endure the long winter, it'll be a nice reward to see which species will fill this meadow next spring. And with every day that passed, I was getting more and more signs that winter was on its way. Although the bulk of the bird migration is later in the fall, by mid-August we were already getting our first wave of migrants. Juvenile bald eagles were soaring high above the homestead. Hooded mergansers and solitary sandpipers were stopping by our ponds. And warblers were frantically foraging throughout the forest. One of my favorite ways to observe migrants is to scope out some of our summer fruit-bearing trees. Our biggest mountain ash was a magnet for birds last year, but this winter, one of its 3 trunks broke off in a storm, and this summer a second trunk cracked under the load of fruit. So with 1 trunk remaining, it wasn't nearly as busy as it used to be. On the other hand, it was a really good year for chokecherries, and the trees were filled with waxwings and robins. Spring migration and fall migration are 2 completely different experiences. In the spring, birds are practicing their vocalizations, establishing territories, and fueling up for their long journey back to the North Woods. With no leaves on the trees, it's way easier to locate them, and I can put together a pretty accurate list by sight and sound of all the birds moving through the Wildlife Homestead. Not to mention, most of these birds are sporting their fresh new breeding plumage, so they're also looking their best. But in the autumn, the birds have molted into their drabber fall plumage. They're less vocal, so I'm mostly looking for movement in the trees, and even after I locate them, there's a good chance they're completely hidden by leaves. So I'd say that the fall migration is and was definitely more of a grind. I don't envy the birds for having to endure the long and dangerous migration, but as they soar high in the sky and follow the changing leaves south to their wintering grounds, I'll admit I'm kind of jealous because it really is the best way to experience the fall foliage. With the trees at their most colorful and vibrant, it's hard not to feel a little bittersweet knowing the growing season is coming to an end. But for insects, the season is far from over. There are plenty of fall-blooming wildflowers just as bright and beautiful as the trees around them. Even though most insects are done breeding, these late blooms are crucial for giving them the energy they need to get through the winter. There's one little area at the front of the property where I involuntarily created a nice meadow of these flowers. It's a bit of a head scratcher for me as to why it happened. I think I know why, but maybe some of you can give some other theories. I mentioned before that when we moved here, I decided not to mow any of the lawn just to see which species were already established. There's this little meadow in the corner of the lot, and if we pause the video, you can see oxeye daisies, buttercups, and hawkweeds growing. Now, they look nice, but these are all invasive in our area, so over the winter I was trying to plan what to do with this space. I thought of maybe ripping out all the sod and reseeding the area, or possibly even solarizing the ground with a tarp. But to my surprise, this year there were barely any oxeye daisies, there were almost no hawkweeds or buttercups, and by fall the meadow was filled with natives, goldenrods, asters, and white turtlehead. It honestly looks like a completely different meadow, and I find it kind of hard to believe that this would have happened so quickly over one season. My guess is that these native species were here for years, just constantly getting mowed over and were unable to establish. By me not mowing this area until the late fall, it gave them an entire growing season to build up reserves, which allowed them to take off and dominate the meadow this year. That's my main theory, but let me know what you think. While the insects feasted on the abundance of wildflowers, some of the other wildlife had to get creative, as a critical food source was missing this year. It was a terrible year for beaked hazelnuts. Out of the hundreds of shrubs we have, I think I found something like 3 or 4 hazelnuts. So the red squirrels and chipmunks had to rely on other food sources. Red squirrels climbed high into the trees to harvest spruce and pine cones, while closer to the ground, mushrooms seemed to be a more important resource this fall. From the forest floor to the canopy, it was a race to gather whatever food was available before the snow arrived. There were ants taking advantage of the last fruits of the season. Sapsuckers were drilling holes into our apple trees. And around the same time, a big group of yellow rump warblers were migrating through. Yellow rumps, or as many birders call them, butterbutts, are one of the first warbler species to return in the spring and one of the last to leave in the fall. Because they migrate on the extremes of both seasons, weather can be wildly unpredictable. So whereas most warbler species are primarily insectivorous, butterbutts have a much more diverse diet to survive during these unpredictable times. They not only feed on insects, but also berries, fruit, and suet if it's available. And these ones were even drinking sap out of the wells drilled by sapsuckers. Even though there were a lot of yellow rumps, overall it was once again a slow and inconsistent fall migration, which made it the perfect time to do a round of offloading trail cameras. I was excited to see what had been at the creek over the past few months, and I was not disappointed. It seems like such an insignificant thing to do, to drop a log across a creek that's barely a couple feet wide in the summer, but even though it's simple, I really can't deny the results. glad I was able to get a ton of clips of fishers. I intended to set up den boxes for them this year, but when scouting where to put them, I couldn't really settle on a spot. I figured it wouldn't hurt to wait another year and study more of the trail camera footage to try to pick up on some of their patterns. They're definitely not the easiest subjects to study. Their home ranges are quite big, and just one fisher would have a territory that extends well beyond our property. Over the past 2 years, I've gotten around 200 trail camera clips of fishers, and out of all of those, I've only ever seen them use our road twice. So they prefer to stay hidden within the forest, but most of the other animals don't mind using our roads. I was a little surprised to see the big deer family was still alive and well. Having an extra fawn to take care of doesn't come without its challenges. It takes an experienced and patient doe to keep all of them well fed and protected. There were also many videos of this moose calf that was growing fast. Next to its mother, it looks like a cute little moose, but if I superimpose myself standing in the same spot, you can see that this baby is already an absolute unit. And if it's lucky, maybe in a few years it'll reach the size of some of the bulls that are rarely seen on the Wildlife Homestead. In the distance, I could already see snow accumulating on the highest peak. Down on our property, the tamaracks, which are unique species of deciduous conifer that shed all of their needles every fall, were the last tree to change colors, from a deep green to a bright gold. This was my cue to slowly start up my bird feeding stations again. For most of the growing season, I don't really keep the feeders full, besides a few for the hummingbirds. There's plenty of natural food around that the feeders are rarely used, so I only focus on them from late fall to early spring. The timing lines up perfectly with the return of Dot and Tui. They disappeared during the breeding season. I haven't figured out which area they're nesting in yet, but this is the second year that they return in the fall to visit their personal portable bird feeder. We also had red foxes return and start using the vernal pond. It was nice to see them again. It was a pretty bad year for red fox sightings. Last year we had the adults raise 5 kits right around our garage. We were able to see them every day for hours on end. But this year we rarely saw the kits, and when they would show up there would only be 2. To make matters worse, one morning my partner was walking our dog and she found one of the kits barely breathing in the middle of the road. She was able to bring her inside and we warmed her up while we got in contact with a rehab center. Some centers can only take animals from their area, and the closest one was a few hours away, so we were a little worried. But luckily they were able to take her in as long as we drove her to the center. She was good the whole way and we were able to drop her off without a hitch. We got an email back a couple of weeks later, and thankfully she had stabilized and was starting to recover with a group of other injured red fox kits that were brought in. Comparing both years, it seemed like the red foxes faced quite a few more challenges this year, so it was encouraging to watch them have a bit of fun while hunting around the vernal pond. Towards the end of the season, I had a good laugh watching this crafty fox steal apples from our tree. I spent a good chunk of the fall planning, preparing, and working on projects for year 3, but my work was cut short from the snow. Last year seemed to be an abnormally warm winter for this region. I remember I made a note that on December 26th, the ground was still visible, it was warm and rainy, and I even saw a Canada jay pick off an earthworm from the top of the grass. This year seems to be following a more typical winter pattern. In early November, we were getting our first dustings, and around mid-November, the snow had blanketed the landscape. With the season coming to an end, it was time to check on the bluebird box that was taken over by bumblebees. The snow's come a month earlier this year, so time to check the bumblebee box. I'm just making sure no red squirrel or mouse has gotten in there because bumblebees will take over old rodent nests. So don't want to disturb them if they're in here. I actually can't pry this open. Whatever they did in here, oh my gosh, they did a good job. Finally got it open, and yeah, it's an old red squirrel nest that was taken over by the bumblebees. So I can't really take this out now, it's all frozen in there, but I'll come back in the spring and give fresh bedding, maybe put some fur in there, some grasses, and hopefully we get bumblebees coming back here again. To end off the year, I did one last trail camera check, and I would say that we definitely saved the best for last. Starting with the most common species in the late fall, the white-tailed deer, I saw clips of the 3 fawns that had now lost their spots and were putting on their winter coats. During the rut, a few bucks showed up, mostly smaller and medium-sized ones. Our area is more suited for moose than it is deer, so I've yet to see any really impressive bucks. In our stand of conifers, I got a couple of clips of an owl chasing down a snowshoe hare. You'll see it flash in really quick on the left side. The footage isn't great, but it looks to me like a barred owl, so I'm glad to see that they're still hanging around. The best sighting of the year though has to go to the Canada lynx. This is only the second one we've seen here. I'm sure there's more because this one triggered 2 cameras, one by the forest pond and one at the back of the property. And between those 2 cameras are 11 others that it didn't trigger, so I can definitely see how easy it is for them to pass through unnoticed. This was the perfect way to end year 2. Despite having a lot of good moments, in some regards it was actually a down year. Spring came 2 weeks early and it threw off the whole flow of migration. We didn't have nearly as many species or the volume of birds we had in year 1. It was a low year for a lot of our fruiting plants, and the trees also seemed to put out fewer leaves. But in nature, a down year is usually followed by a really productive one. So I'm already dreaming about what year 3 has in store for us on the Wildlife Homestead.